So good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll start anyway, because I think people will drift in, and they don't want to listen to me anyway. They want to listen to you, so I can drag on for 3 minutes, and then people can start coming in. But my name is Paul Ladd. I'm the director of the UN Research Institute for Social Development, and I'm the moderator of this session, which is on tackling the multiple challenges, strengthening health system, food security, and socio-economic recovery. For those of you that don't know the UN Research Institute for Social Development, or UNRISD, we are an autonomous research institute based within the United Nations system, established and having been based in Geneva since 1963. Now, autonomy is very important for us. It means that our board is comprised of top academic advisors around the world, so not member states in this case. We're also extra budgetary, entirely voluntarily funded, so we have to prove our worth and our value added in the marketplace. But that generally gives us a really good space to ask the hard questions about development, about power, about distribution, and about cooperation. Our research strategy is focused on reducing inequalities. And indeed, our most recent contribution was about the relationship between crises and inequalities, and different types of inequalities. And that's this, Crises of Inequality. It's based on our website, of course. Now, the session we're holding now is not so much about the crises themselves or their impacts, but rather about the role that development cooperation plays and is playing in supporting countries to respond to these crises, and specifically whether the effectiveness principles, ownership, focus on results, inclusive partnerships, and transparency and mutual accountability were followed, and if they worked. So could development cooperation have been better in supporting countries to respond immediately to the impacts, but also at the same time retaining investment in long-term systems for resilience and protecting long-term sustainable development? In the session now, first we're going to hear from the Secretary General of UNCTAD, Rebecca Grinspan, who will set the scene for our discussion, the multiple crises, the importance of country leadership and the coordination of responses, and the role of effectiveness of cooperation and assistance. Then we're going to hear from a range of experts and leaders from different perspectives, from governments as recipients of cooperation, as providers of cooperation, and the UN system, and from civil society, and from foundations. And then hopefully we'll have time for interventions and questions from the audience. It's a very packed panel. We've got lots of speakers. It's going to be difficult to keep it to time, but I do hope you bear with us. And that's why I'm going to stop here and invite Rebecca to come up to this podium to offer the framing remarks. Thank you. Just sit here.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Paul, for your kind welcoming words and for all the good work UNRISD does. So really thank you. And everybody, excellencies, distinguished panelists, distinguished delegates, dear friends. I have been given the hard task of setting the stage to the excellent expert panel that follows right after. I will do my best. Promise. I will divide my presentation into parts. First, I will talk about the context of the multiple challenges. And second, I will discuss what these global contexts mean for national governments in developing countries. I will then close with a reflection on the importance of the 4 principles of the global partnership in the times we live. So time is short, so allow me to jump straight in. And I will start with the context. As this session suggests, we are in a world of cascading crises. COVID, climate change, and the cost of living crisis are all increasing poverty and hunger at alarming speed. Geopolitics, not economics, is now at the driving seat of globalization. Funding gaps for SDGs investments in developing countries are increasing, and debt burdens are turning unbearable for countries in the global south. Now, cascading crises mean cascading inequalities, as Paul was saying. We have a crisis of inequalities. We saw this all too crudely during COVID. Almost everywhere one looked, gaps that were already too wide got wider. This was true for gender gaps, for rural-urban gaps, for wealth and income gaps, for digital access gaps, for formal versus informal employment gaps. Inequalities, we have to understand, makes us fragile. Closing gaps builds resilience. People are at the center of this reinforcing each other cascade of crises. People who, shock after shock, have depleted their capacity to cope with disaster. Because these are global disasters. These are not one country disasters, are systemic disasters. People who are falling in record numbers into poverty, as I said before, people who are becoming increasingly disillusioned with their governments and political systems. And most dramatically, people who are skipping meals, especially women and girls. Acute food insecurity has tripled in 3 years, from 135 million before COVID to almost 350 million today. This is according to FAO and the WFP. Heartbreakingly, over 1 million people are in a state of famine in 6 countries in the world. We haven't seen this since decades. Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Haiti, South Sudan, Somalia, and Yemen. And famine, let's leave the euphemism aside, means people literally dying of hunger. In all, the UN Global Crisis Response Group, of which I am part, estimates that over 1.6 billion people in over 90 countries are currently in a state of severe vulnerability. And vulnerability doesn't come only from the impact of the crisis. It comes from the inability to cope. And because these cascading crises, because these growing inequalities, they are households in countries are less able to cope today than they were 3 years ago. So as you probably know, the UN Global Crisis Response Group is made up of 3 work streams: food and fertilizers, finance, and energy. On finance, we have asked for concrete solutions to increase countries' liquidity, fiscal space, and investment. For 2023, we are especially focusing on debt issues, which is a growing and very worrying problem. According to the IMF, 60% of all low-income countries and 1/4 of all middle-income countries are in debt distress. But the issue is not contained only to the developing world. According to the Institute of International Finance, we started this year with a record debt bulk of over $300 trillion. It's true that most of it is in the rich world, but they have more means to cope. So this number is more than 3.5 times global GDP, more than 3.5 times global GDP. So the world is now more than $1,000 in debt for every star in the Milky Way. As interest rates rise, this tremendous debt burden is starting to shake. And if we do not set in place the appropriate multilateral mechanisms for debt transparency, debt suspension, and debt restructuring, this burden will eventually crumble. On the food work stream, our work has focused on bringing food prices down and ease the cost of living crisis we are going through. The UN has made an important contribution through the 2 Istanbul Food and Fertilizer Agreements, including the Black Sea Grain Initiative. But a big issue remains, which is the fertilizer crisis. So since 2019, food prices have increased by half, while fertilizer prices have increased by 2.5 times. In some countries, more than that. So what farmers are selling today is not enough to cover what they need to spend to produce it. This is especially true for smallholders in the developing world, particularly in Africa, but also in Latin America, in East Asia, which is expected to decline its fertilizer consumption by 1/5 this year. According to a recent forecast from the International Fertilizer Association, because of this fertilizer scramble, next year agricultural production will decline, the production of food will decline by the equivalent of 216 trillion calories, or what is enough to feed 3.6 billion people, about half of humanity, for a month. This will transform the current food affordability crisis that we are in into a food availability crisis next year. This issue, coupled with the debt issue and increasing geopolitical tension, including in energy markets, is signaling that next year will be even tougher than this one. Here, let me go to the second part of my presentation on how this is felt in developing countries and what can development cooperation do. So my main message is this: effective development cooperation has never been more important, has never been more important than it is today. There is simply no way out of this crisis without an enabling international environment, which can redirect resources to where they are most needed. So, allow me to turn now to the global partnership 4 principles: ownership, focus on results, inclusive partnerships, transparency, and mutual accountability. Very important, each of them. But let me focus especially on the ownership and results part, and then add one final point of reflection. So first, on ownership. We need ownership because all development cooperation projects are at the end about people and institutions that need to embrace the responsibility for the success or failure of what happens. So ownership calls for a more horizontal approach, for respect and humbleness. It's not that all the problems are in one side and all of the solutions are on the other. And definitely, there is no one-size-fits-all. Respect for local knowledge, for policy opportunities and constraints, for consensus building, for knowledge sharing, where South-South and triangular cooperation can be very effective, should be part of development effectiveness under this principle. And this is a change, it's a mindset change. It's not a technical change, it's a mindset change. Going for a horizontal versus a vertical approach. This is a cultural change in the cooperation community. Second, focusing on results, which is very important for all stakeholders involved. Here, I just want to remind us all that results in development are difficult to measure. Development is complex and is long-term. It is crucial that we do all we can to measure and to be accountable. We need to develop sensible intermediate goals in a way that makes our work more effective and efficient. I agree with that. But we must find room for the long term in our results-based strategies. And development cooperation has to stick to long-term targets. It has to persevere, to learn from the evolution of the cooperation. But it cannot go for the long-hanging fruits only and for the short-term results only. I know how difficult this is, because we have also to convince our citizens in the cooperating countries and maintain the political will. But if we are serious about development, there is no short-term development effectiveness we can sell. And we have to say this somehow. Now, I remember when we were discussing about this issue and how to measure, I always used to bring this joke about a drunk that was looking for his keys. And he was looking for his keys in below a street lamp, yes? A street light. And so somebody passed by and says, so did you lose your keys here? And he said, no, I didn't, but it's the only place where there is light. Sometimes it happens to us that we go for a measure just because it exists, but it's not where we lost our keys. Yes? And we need to face this together. Yeah. My final point is a reflection on a key issue which we should do more to highlight. That is policy coherence. One of the big differences between aid and cooperation is that when we do cooperation, policy coherence matters much more. If we don't have policy coherence in trade and in rules and regulations, in climate and environmental policy, in interest rates policy, in the international financial system, what we do with the left hand will be overrun with what we do with the right hand. It is important that we recover the principles of policy coherence. The development cooperation actors have to be in the room when decisions are made, and that countries build a more holistic approach to development cooperation, including teams from different ministers and institutions. There is no development effectiveness without policy coherence. So, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the world is indeed in a cascading crisis, and the cascade is far from being over. Debt and fertilizers, for example, may compound the situation next year. And to get out of this cascade, we must literally jump and leapfrog out. And for this, we need collective action. We need to use all the tools we have at hand. We need to innovate, but above all, we need to come together under the umbrella of solidarity and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. So can I invite my panelists to come up to the stage, roughly from left to right, in the order that they know they're going to be speaking? I'm taking that chair over there. Okay. So I think you are about here. Sorry, Osa. Yes, but it doesn't really matter. I think I can find you. Yes, please. You can swap. It's fine. I can handle it. So first of all, let me thank Rebecca, of course, for what was an expected, excellent introduction. And the issue of policy coherence came up in the introductory session as well. It's development cooperation, and it's effective development cooperation, but it's also about trade, it's also about debt, it's about finance, it's about migration, it's about arms as well. There are lots and lots of components to policy coherence. And I'm going to start our panel by introducing Mr. Tawfiq Hanafi, who's the Executive Secretary of the Ministry of National Development Planning and the Chief Secretary of BAPANAS, which actually was the first agency I came to work with DFID in 1997, a very long time ago. It's great to have you here. And of course, you've been dealing with these crises yourself as a country, but you've also played an important role in hosting the G20 recently, and the G20 development ministers. And I wanted to ask you, what would you say were the key messages from the G20 development ministers, and what did they commit to?
Thank you, Paul. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, upon Indonesia's G20 presidency, let me begin by sharing several important output from recent development ministerial meeting that we believe are essential in fostering recovery, addressing development challenges, and accelerating SDGs achievement. First, the G20 roadmap for a stronger recovery and resilience, which contains collective actions in 3 key areas: micro, small, medium enterprises, adaptive social protection, and green economy. Among all, we propose the South-South triangular cooperation as one of the strategic and important ways to advance collective actions in a global manner. This is our main focus in the G20 Development Working Group. The second is G20 principle to scale up blended finance, which set out a set of voluntary principles to scale up blended finance implementation. The third one is Chair's summary on multilateralism for SDGs, containing call for reinvigorated multilateralism and supporting multilateral development cooperation in addressing development challenges, ensuring delivery of SDGs achievement, and realizing a more equitable, more resilient, and more sustainable world. Indonesia's international development cooperations is in line with the GPEDC principles. Since 2020, Indonesia actively shares the best practices of GPEDC principles implementation in private sector engagement, triangular cooperation, and South-South cooperation. We believe that country ownership is the basic principle to maximize the impact of development cooperation on the ground. In ensuring inclusive partnership, we have promoted the multi-stakeholder partnership approaches, including through pilot project to accelerate socio-economic recovery at the local level. This morning in Indonesia, Ministry of Planning organized what we call public consultation meeting. Actually, we invite the private sectors to provide the inputs in formulating next annual plan 2024. I think the private sector partnership is very critical. And early this month, Ministry of Planning, Republic of Indonesia also organized SDGs annual conference. And we also invite the private sectors to make sure we're able to localize SDGs. That's very critical. So that's the basic, outcomes that I want to share in this important conference.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. That gets us off to a great start. And I wanted to turn next to a couple of really country experiences. And first of all, to ask Mr. Richard Tusabe, who's the Minister of State in charge of the National Treasury in Rwanda. Clearly, also, these challenges have been hitting you thick and fast. And I want to ask you frankly and honestly, how have development partners supported you? And do you have any insights for how, as these crises will come in the future too, how can they support you better?
Thank you very much. To answer your question, yes, the development partners have really supported us. And I try to, first of all, speak on how that happened, but also how was the landscape even before the crisis came in. So first of all, when you look at when the COVID-19 pandemic came in, first of all, we were supposed to protect the livelihood of the citizens. And the best way to do that was to do it with the support of the development partners. So immediately, we set up what we call a recovery plan. A recovery plan that was looking at the livelihood of the citizens, especially on the health sector. How do you get the vaccines in place? How do you get all the COVID-19 related tools to fight COVID? As you know, we went through a lockdown for such a long time. By number two, to get the vaccine in place. There was really shortage of vaccine. And we had to make sure that we had, first of the countries that really tapped into that resource. So with the support of the development partners, we had to make sure that we get that right. By number two, we needed also to get in place a recovery plan, because whenever the shock hits home, you need also to keep an eye on the medium-term and long-term game. So you don't want to lose your focus on long-term, and then you fix this crisis, and then you have another crisis. So by doing that, we set up also an economic recovery fund. Mm-hmm. And this time, mainly focusing on private sector, because the private sector was under tremendous shock with the lockdown. The financial sector was under stress with non-performing loans coming up. So you need really to go and find a way of working with the development partners. So immediately we got a fund of about $100 million to start with, which we later increased to by another 150. And that was basically to cushion and protect the most affected sectors, like hospitality. So that's how you need really to be working with the development partners. But how do you get to do that is what is important. So the landscape was already prepared in the sense that our development partners have different forums where we work with them. All our support from the development partners is purely country ownership, but leveraging on their partnership to support us, and we involve them in the planning process. We have the Vision 2050, Vision 2020, and now the NST1, which is ending in 2024. So they are part of that journey. So when the shock comes in, they need to come and say, okay, what are the key indicators that we are looking at? How do we keep an eye on these indicators and make sure that we don't lose focus? So, but also when you get into measuring results, we have different forums where we have what we call the sector working groups. If the sector on social protection, we have division of labor with the development partners. We have development partners focusing on social protection. We have partners focusing on education. We have partners focusing on health. And we have partners focusing on decentralization. So that gives you a chance to avoid duplication of resources and to know who is doing what and how. I think there was a strong statement on policy coherence. How do these feed into each other to feed into the bigger mandate of the strategic vision of the country? Then we have what we call the Development Partners Coordination Group, where we meet on a quarterly basis and take stock of what was worked under the sector working group and what is not working. Then at the end of the year, like now we have one coming up in January, we have what we call Development Partners Retreat. It is 4 days retreat with all the development partners, led by the Minister of Finance and Economic Planning. We take stock of the Warriors exercise, what happened, what didn't work, and then we set the stage for the next year. So to answer your question, yes, development partners are amazing partners, but you need to involve them from the start. You don't bring them when you're in a crisis and then you don't know which pieces to pick. But when they know which pieces to pick, having been involved in planning, oh yes, it makes life extremely easy. And it has been demonstrated in how we've recovered with even, of course, we got a contraction of 3% contraction. In 2020, 2021, 10.3% growth. This year, we're looking at about above 7% growth. It's all because of those efforts where we involve them in our development agenda. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So your leadership, your coordination, different sectors across government. But I think you also mentioned this, this dilemma, effectively, of responding to short-term socioeconomic impacts in this case, versus, of course, retaining investments and a long-term vision for sustainable development across the board. And then perhaps that's really going to be my question for Ms. Bjorg-Sangsha, if I'm roughly correct, thank you, who's the Secretary of State in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway. And I think a lot of, certainly those of us in the research community are studying carefully, if you like, the rise in the humanitarian demand on the one side, or the short-term demand, versus, of course, within a fixed envelope because of domestic pressures, the investments being made in helping countries in their long-term investments. And I just wanted to ask you how you've handled that as a development cooperation partner.
No, thank you. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that it is a real challenge to balance those concerns. But I think it's important for us, first of all, we see the crises and the descriptions that we had from the head of UNCTAD. I agree totally. And it's harrowing and shocking to see how the multiple crises increase the different inequalities that you described so vividly. And it's very important for us as development partners that we are then able to try to meet the short-term needs, the acute needs that we see when there's a consequence of the climate crisis, a flood or a drought, and balance that against the more long-term thinking. And of course, we also know that the best response to a crisis is to have good systems in place. So if we try to shift our thinking away from this pitting the two against each other, to try to see the two connected, and this is completely in line or in the same vein as the thinking and the recommendations from the OECD DAC about this, what we call the nexus thinking, about how we see short-term, long-term, and the peace issues together. But it is, are we very good at it? No, not really. I mean, the pandemic we were forewarned of the pandemic for years before it hit us, yet we were not prepared. The crisis that we are seeing now in terms of energy and moving into the crisis of fertilizer and food security, that is a result of many factors, including the current war on this continent, is also something that has been building up over time. And so we need to get a lot better at addressing that. And the way we are doing it from the Norwegian perspective is that we are looking at one area is that we've seen that in particular the pandemic, but also now the crisis of energy and food, is it exposes the vulnerability of the global value chains. And so if we can, we are all in this together. Clearly we need to trade. So I'm not saying we're not going to trade, but at the same time, there are vulnerabilities in the global value chains that mean that we need to look very carefully at whether we as development partners can support local and regional value chains. And for food production and for pharmaceutical production, we are moving, and again, with partners and with countries, into looking at how can we support, for example, local food production on the African continent. Why on earth should the African continent import food to the value of $50–60 billion a year? So we are working together, and I hear from many of our African partners on the African continent, that these efforts are happening there. We would like to move in and try to support that, support those local and regional value chains. And there's a lot happening on the African continent to support that. And the same thing for pharmaceutical production. A lot happening again on the African continent in terms of vaccine production that Norway supports together with partners again, and other support for, you could call it not just production, but ecosystems around pharmaceutical manufacturing. And I think of that as part of that bigger picture of supporting country ownership and the whole discussion around what we call localization of development, which is very closely linked to country ownership, but shifting some of that power from the global north to the regions that are the most vulnerable to some of these shocks.
I think it was the same in the West and North America as well. It resonates with the argument of new industrial policy as well, how countries are sufficient in which sectors, north or south, to cope with crises that come in the future. But one thing is clear, moving on, is that whether they're short-term or long-term or in the middle, it's always women and girls that lose out across the board consistently. And therefore, I wanted to ask Åsa Regner, who's the Deputy Executive Director of UN Women in New York, knowing this, how have you been helping governments all around the world to cope with this gender bias and gendered impacts of these interlocking crises? And because you also do so much work on gender responsive budgeting, and at the end of the day, where you place your money is also shows where you place your priorities, how have you seen that evolving in countries through these crises?
Thank you so much. Sorry. Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to my fellow panelists and to Rebecca. And to start right away, one thing we did together with Rebecca under her leadership in the UN crisis response management that she leads, we issued a policy brief on how the food and fuel crisis, what impact it has on women around the world. So one very important point of action for us is to collect data, disseminate it, and then help governments and other stakeholders to find the right measures to change the situation. Because as you said, we do see that these crises, whether it's food, whether it's energy, whether it's climate change, whether it's armed conflict, they have a different and often more severe impact on women and girls, and especially the poorest one. So we are supporting governments and countries and women's organizations in all the work that we do. And I think that the women's organization, the representative from the women's organization this morning in the opening, she also made a very important point that governments, and we know that both in the global north and the global south, have not done enough to live up to international agreements on gender equality. They have not respected and implemented women's rights. And had they done that and also invested in those rights earlier, we would have been better off right now. And I think she's so right about that. It's also our analysis when we take stock of where the world is in relation to Goal 5. So when we ask women, because we always do that, I think we're very well connected to women's organizations all over the world. And when there is a crisis, we ask them how they see their situation and their needs. And their first response is always that they worry about and they want support in relation to their own livelihoods. They always know that they have to lead families, communities, and support their children and themselves. And also, when they have their own livelihoods, they can choose to leave violent relationships, for example, or they can choose education for their children, and etc. So this is always something that they put first on the list. And it's something that we are also working with. And one example, very concrete, of what we're doing in relation to that is that we work in Senegal to assess care needs, because you often need somebody else to take care of small children or maybe of elderly in order for women and men to take up paid work. So for women farmers in cooperatives, we have identified how the Senegalese government can support women farmers for other people to support children and other dependents, so that women can actually take up work in agriculture, just as one example. And care is something that women also point out. And another thing that we do together with ILO, we have developed a policy tool to help governments assess what are the needs, how can they cover them, what would it cost, and who could be responsible for doing different parts to establish a care system to support women's livelihoods. Also, another example of what women point out is that they want to be part of leadership and decision-making in crisis, for example, around climate change. And we have developed tools for women to be part of decision-making in the green transition in many different countries, together with governments and civil society. And I think I need to point out also that what we need in the world are power shifts from men to women, from urban decision makers to rural decision makers, from white people to black people all over the world. And these power shifts have not happened enough. And we know nowadays what we need to do, but we haven't done it. And that is very important. And I think that one tool for the power shifts and for the good measures, the actions that we know work, and for gender equality and justice is to work on the national budgets, as you say. And we do that together with governments who want to. And yes, there is more interest after COVID, although with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and increased military spending, increased concern about security, etc., we see that there would perhaps be more focus on this had that not happened. But we do work together with governments on their budgets to see to it how more resources can be allocated for gender equality and women's rights, how transparency and accountability can be increased, and how women's organizations can be part of monitoring bodies in relation to this work. So yes, there are many concrete measures that we can take to improve the gaps that we see and that we have documented. So that's a big part of what we do. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned care, because I know UN Women played a formative role in establishing the Global Alliance for Care with the government of Mexico and others. And I was actually moderating a session at the WTO Congress on gender the other day. And all of the discussion, 99% of the discussion, was about women's entrepreneurship, their contribution to economic growth and trade. And nobody mentioned the structural deficit, if you like, the blind spot of capitalism that sits underneath it, in that the burden of care falls on women. So I think it's really important that if we're talking about recovery, we have to talk about systemic and structural investments in systems that allow for women's participation in economic activity, but also politics as well.
If I can mention just very quickly, for example, in Ukraine, that has an elderly population that is bigger than in many other countries with war and armed conflict. Women right now are those who actually care for elderly in that country, and also dependent family members who have disabilities and so on. So yeah, that's a very big issue also in crisis settings. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we've heard a little bit from governments on different sides. We've heard from the UN. I'd like to turn off, of course, it's a very complex map of stakeholders, and very important within that is the role that foundations play. And Gargi Ghosh is the president of Policy and Advocacy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I would like to ask you what role you've been playing in the last 2 to 3 years, understanding, talking to, responding to, supporting countries, governments, but also civil society groups through these crises. And how do you talk to people to actually understand what best support you can provide.
Sure, thank you, and thank you for having me. I couldn't agree more with the way the current situation has been framed, not just as polycrises, but really interlocking crises. And I think that is what's been inspiring our work over the past few years. To give you an example, it was the pandemic that stressed supply chains so badly that they were less resilient than they might have been when the food shock hit. Similarly, inflation is now making debt burdens acutely worse just as the import bill is increasing. So you can't just look at our problems as sort of individual challenges to pick off. You have to, as you're saying, look at the system underlying. It's not just, of course it is, solving the acute food shortage, but it's also about looking at the food systems and the extent to which smallholder producers in particular have been left out of the story of productivity growth and connections to markets. Similarly, on vaccines, an area we work on dearly, yes, the world tried to come together to deliver vaccines globally during the pandemic, not fast enough, not enough, and you have to look at how our pandemic preparedness system as a whole failed us in that moment. What were the protocols, the governance structures, the regulatory systems, the production capabilities that led to that acute failure of the system? So as soon as you start talking about and thinking about systemic failures, you are inherently talking about multi-stakeholder participation. Anything less really shortchanges the issue. And for us, we see ourselves as part of that system, but with strengths and weaknesses. We are not a diplomatic organization with the capability to negotiate treaties. We are not an implementing organization that can deliver programs on the ground. Our resources are financial. Sometimes they seem like a lot at this moment. They are just a drop in the bucket. We have some technical expertise. But we do also have the ability to bring together stakeholders from different parts of society. We have the ability to work effectively with the private sector. We work very closely with governments, including both Indonesia and Rwanda on this stage. We work very closely with donors. And so in this moment, we have been very focused on our role bringing together perspectives on the challenges facing countries and people where we work. Let me give you an example of how that looks in the agriculture space. 4 areas. First, the acute crisis. There we have just been part of the manifold response to calls from the World Food Program and other organizations to support the immediate. But we have also very quickly looked at issues of productivity this growing season and next growing season, because we know food aid is not the solution. When we look at productivity, when we talk to farmers in the countries where we work, in the networks, through the networks that we support, we understand fertilizer to be a major issue. Now, governments have been part of ensuring that fertilizer moves across the Black Sea. We have also been engaging with private sector producers of fertilizer, including a number on the African continent where shipping costs, transit time is much less, to ensure that fertilizer is available and accessible as best we can. We have lots of work to do there. We work with UN Women on understanding the particular needs of women farmers. 40 to 50% of smallholder farmers in Africa, of course, are women. And yet we know the systems of access to capital, access to market information are biased against them. So how do we take particular attention to the needs of all farmers? Finally, we have been very vocal in wanting to connect the agricultural issues today to climate, and in particular, the need for adaptation. We know that in the last COP, adaptation was finally on the agenda. We have not yet seen, but are still hoping to see, a doubling of adaptation finance, because that, of course, is the long-term sustainability or productivity of the agricultural system. So our role has very much been to work across sectors that tend not to speak to each other, but that is very much needed at this moment, to be able to step in and offer our support where needed. There's another area I hope we'll come back to later in the panel where I think exactly this kind of systemic work is needed, and that's on the debt situation, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. For me, nothing gets better until we have the fiscal situation of these countries ready for country leadership to get back on the development path. So I hope we have a chance to talk about that.
Yeah,
Thanks.
great. Thank you, Gagi. I just want to say before I turn to the next panelist, Georgina Munoz, who'll be speaking in Spanish. So if you want to put on your headphones ready, and I will also do so because my Spanish is not yet strong enough. But Georgina is the co-president of Red Latinoamericana por Justicia Económica y Social. Also plays a strong role in
economic justice, social justice.
Civil society representative on the panel, and of course the first thing to say is that the diversity and heterogeneity within civil society is so huge. It's a very big first question to ask you, but the question is this. Generally, for NGOs, for civil society groups, what have been the challenges and opportunities during this period of interlocked and rolling crises? And then again, the straight, honest question, where you've seen bilateral, multilateral UN development partners, where have you seen them go wrong? What could they have been doing better?
Gracias por la invitación.
Well, thank you very much for this invitation, UNDP and the government of Switzerland, and to make it possible for us, the civic society organizations, to be present. We've been asking for this at all levels, local, regional, national, global. I am from the AOID. I'm in the local network, in addition to what Paul mentioned. And I'd like to share with you the outcome, the visions, the experience that we have examined in the very various areas, as well as the studies. In fact, the pandemic took place in a world system that prioritizes growth and the marketplace. And we already have had a number of neoliberal decades which had stressed privatization of health. And practically the pandemic exposed how fragile and how unresponsive those systems were. And I think we have to be very well aware, and we must understand that we need a completely different approach as the civil society organizations are putting forward, where change processes can be strengthened that will take us to a solution for the structural problems that our economies suffer from and which our social and political systems suffer from as well. But also, in addition to this, I would think it's important to say that when we're talking about the COVID vaccinations for the pandemic, these were not accessible for countries of the global south. And I think that we have to have a better balance. We must strike a balance, a better balance. In a study that we're carrying out in 33 countries, we were able to see in those countries how the results in terms of the appropriation was extremely unequal. The link with national plans would also have to improve. This is certain. We saw there was a very low level of participation of the organizations, of the movements, of the farmers groups, for example, farmers associations, in the processes that the governments were developing. I'm talking about consultation when we talked about the health policies that had to be developed for the affected population. very little contact with the farmers. And after so many years of war and conflict, it's not just the war, there's a whole history behind all of this. And if you add this to the various economic crises that we've experienced and which have been where the living conditions of the world have been going from bad to worse, we really need to have a priority in terms of the effects that are on the workers, affects how the workers are affected in the difficult economic situation that they are experiencing. I'm talking about people in our countries, and also the weight they have to carry on their shoulders, the marginalized people, for example, the ones who are not included, left out. And we believe that there have been all sorts of obstacles in terms of the space that was needed. We need more participation from the side of the organizations. Why? Well, because we're not competing. Organizations are in the field, they're on the ground. We're very closely linked to the population, and we have a responsibility as well to make sure that the policies that governments are implementing should respond to the needs of the populations. And this is why we invite our governments to open up a space for dialogue to be able to implement in a more effective way cooperation for development, and to be able to really go hand in hand with a transformation of the realities, which is a shared responsibility after all. There are a number of opportunities, and even in a crisis, even in a pandemic, you have opportunities, the silver lining, as it were. One of them goes beyond finding a response for the pandemic, but it involves responding to the development that we need, to the appeals and the demands from the side of the people, the real needs of the population. Why not say it honestly, to talk about regional policies on the various continents, because there are similarities, and in this way we can have an exchange of experience, we can carry out transformations, we can contribute to a new way of thinking, a new line of thinking, a new policy that will take the realities of people and transform them. In addition, we would like to touch upon the following: the privatization of public services and the fiscal policies that are regressive do not help the people. They don't help the governments, because we need financing for development. We need the financing, and this has to be a priority. And where is the financing? The financing, the funding for this, we believe that it should fulfill the principles of effective cooperation for development, and it should take steps forward so that we can fulfill the 0.7%, which we have had as a historic target. I think that it is possible, both the North and the South, to fulfill all of these requirements, and whatever is agreed and which leads eventually to international agreements. It is possible. But also the role of ODA is absolutely crucial. We have to respond in the face of such impacts. We cannot simply stand by, as was said in this panel by the various panelists. I think that as they said, there is a quest for these transformative changes. But our appeal would be that we really have to go to the structural causes and make progress this way. I would like, if I may, refer briefly to the propitious environment that we need, autonomy as agents for change and development, but also all of this within the framework of dialogue, consensus, policies, negotiations. And this sort of a context which affects us, of course, when there's a violation of human rights, for example. There are many complaints from our countries in the South about this, or about the pandemic. In the study, it said there that there are military and political sectors that have taken advantage of these resources and the financing. I think that we have to have some deep thinking at the level of the individual states in order to be able to make headway. And I think that the private sector is fundamental in terms of applying the Kampala principles, because that is the key to be able to foster social dialogue with the civil society to make this cooperation more effective, accountability. It's a strategic route or path that allows us to have more confidence, more trust among the multi-actors. And in conclusion, I think there was a question, but how can we assess the providers of help in the last few years? Well, very concretely, from the side of the OECD, we believe that it must be humanist. Those are its origins. It needs to go back to those roots. It has a mission. We're concerned about the trend of cooperation at this time. We fear that it is not fully oriented towards solving these structural problems of development and collective rights, but rather that it is actually depriving, or it is hooking up to financial interests, whereas we should be strengthening the development that each one of the stakeholders requires, each of the states require. So we are asking the international community and the cooperating countries to maintain their cooperation with the civil society organizations, CSOs, in considering a series of actions and links in the various areas, and that in fact there are spaces that need to be opened up so that we can make headway in terms of human rights and democracy. And in closing now, in the current context, multiple crises, in that sort of context, we make an appeal to the stakeholders of development to commit ourselves truly and in an unswerving fashion to be able to fulfill all of the international commitments that have been entered into in order to increase the effectiveness of cooperation for development, linking this up to Agenda 2030 and other agendas. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Georgina. I just want to check with the organisers that we do have Mr. Sostwen Gwengwe, who's the Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs from Malawi. And thank you for joining us. I understand you were in Parliament earlier, so you were joining us a tiny bit late. You've missed some of the conversation. But my question to you is, you've obviously been, like all countries, responding to these crises. And I would, again, like to ask the frank and open question, how have you been supported by development partners? And are there any insights or advice on how the effectiveness principles can be followed more truly?
No, thanks ever so much, moderator. Sorry that I joined in very late. I had originally planned to travel and be with you in person. Unfortunately, we are doing the budget session, and we ran and made it impossible for me to travel, actually. So we just finished the deliberations. The budget has just passed today, but it delayed me joining in. So apologies for that. But allow me to actually present to you a case for Malawi. Over the past 3 years, we've really experienced multiple crises ranging from the cyclones. We had Cyclone Anna and Cyclone Idai, and as most of you would know, COVID-19 did not spare us, and this time around, the Russia-Ukraine war. But beyond these, we've also have a re-emergence of cholera. And we also had a polio scare a few months ago. All of these crises require massive financial resources to effectively respond to. And all of these crises have impacted negatively on food security, people's incomes, and of course, the whole health system of our country. But let me hasten to say that there have been responses to this crisis, both the international crisis or the global crisis, but also our own localized domestic crisis. And I think our immediate reaction and or response to this crisis were first and foremost to look inside and look at our own national budgets to identify and reprioritize our resources so that we respond to the crisis immediately, whilst in the medium to longer term, we're looking for solutions. I can give an example under the COVID-19. We could not afford a complete lockdown as a country, as doing so would have been very detrimental to the economy. So we had to put up a system of working in shifts in the public sector, investing in our ICT to allow for more remote working and more remote learning. We also embarked on building temporary infrastructure to enable students to sit in more spacious classrooms, and that range from primary schools, secondary schools, and even in tertiary education institutions. We had to hire some additional local teachers, and all these interventions needed budgetary adjustments, reallocating from one line to another line. And additional hospital bed space had to be provided to accommodate COVID-19 cases, and all these allocations and actions required financial resources immediately. And that was our starting point in our response to this global crisis. But let me also hasten to say that due to the cyclones, we had had a lot of power disruptions, which are continuing even as we speak. We lost about a third of our generation capacity on the national grid, and the associated impact in the loss of power has really pounded our economy. The private sector is only producing at very significantly reduced capacity. But the support of the international community on this crisis was immediate, and we welcomed the quick response. The resources were mobilized by the international community through various forums. You would remember the G20 initiative on COVID-19. We also benefited from an SDR allocation from the International Monetary Fund. And you also remember the debt service suspension initiative, which we benefited from, and the fast tracking of the World Bank's IDA 19 cycle. All these initiatives were not all well coordinated for maximum impact, and we know that low-income countries could have benefited a lot more in such well-meaning and well-intended initiatives. If I think there was better coordination in terms of putting all these on the ground much quicker. There have been some challenges I would point out. Whilst the support from the international community was there, like the COVAX, the IMF SDR allocations, streamlined IDA 20, but most of the support was too fragmented, mainly coming through as project support, which takes time to implement whilst the suffering of the people continued. We know that money is fungible. Sometimes it's better for quick response and direct response, it's better to provide resources with some parameters which are not too restrictive as resources provided for a specific project. It becomes very difficult, for example, if we have resources for COVID-19, but all of a sudden we are hit by a cholera outbreak, and the resources cannot be transferred from one project to another project. So perhaps what we would suggest from the experiences we had as a country, and this I'm speaking specifically for Malawi, would have been maybe to look at the provision of these resources, but with not too much stringent conditions, like making it too specific for one particular use, but maybe making it a little bit broader so that the countries should be able to have a leeway to be able to use those resources in addressing the challenges which might be beyond the one specific project, in this case, COVID-19, as it were, for us. I can also say that most of the support was not properly aligned to the national plans, hence hence not supportive of the fiscal space, since most of the activities financed were not those prioritized in the national response to such kind of projects. For me, I would say that as far as Malawi is concerned, the support was adequate. The only thing which going forward we can do a little bit better, I think it's on the coordination in the usage of these resources, so that they should be properly aligned with country-specific circumstances, so that we respond to our people better, rather than being too restrictive to the specific project vis-a-vis the COVID-19, as it were, at that time. Allow me to stop there for now. And once again, apologies for not being available in person, but also joining in pretty late.
No, we thank you, Minister,
thank
for
you very
being able
much.
to join us. And also for your frankness in terms of where your insights were on cooperation could be improved. Now, I do apologise it's been so rushed. I do apologise that we didn't have much more time for the panellists, but at this, I'd like to, if you could just join me in thanking the panellists collectively for their initial answers and responses. We have, in the agenda, a Q&A. In practice, there are a couple of people that have asked to make a short intervention, I think one virtually and then 3 in the room at the podium on my right. So I just want to check whether we have the first short intervention lined up virtually. And that will be from Mr. France Fayo, who's the Minister of Cooperation and Humanitarian Action of Luxembourg.
Yes, good afternoon, Paul. Good afternoon to all the panelists. And sorry for not being there in person today in Geneva. I'm just back from a field visit to Laos, one of our partner countries, and really wasn't able to make it to Geneva. So thank you for this very insightful and very interesting discussion. I think a lot of things have been said. I will be very brief. As you know, Luxembourg is a small but very ambitious development cooperation player. We allocate 1% of our GNI to ODA, and of course, although we have a very broad consensus in our population that this is the right thing to do, and we are, of course, mindful of having a maximum impact in everything we are doing. So, of course, the whole team here in Luxembourg is deeply worried about the context of cascading crisis, as it has been described, and of course of being thrown back in our efforts over the past years with these multiple crises. Really, I think 3 brief points from my side. First point is really in that we find that one factor is really important, is key in being successful and being impactful. We see that, first of all, the trust of partner countries is absolutely key. It comes, in our case, from long-term engagement with the countries where we are active, and also alignment with national priorities. And in that respect, of course, being a small country without much of a political agenda is very helpful, but we see this as a crucial point in being more impactful in our projects. Then, of course, another important factor is involving actors from civil society to the private sector in what we are doing, and also in many cases using South-South and triangular cooperation methods in our partner countries. And then the third point is about being innovative. We are putting to use things that we are developing in Luxembourg, such as digital tools, but also inclusive finance in our action in the partner countries. The second point, and this has been made by some of the panelists, we are convinced that women are a key factor in being more effective. We have a strong gender policy and gender strategy in all our action, which is really a horizontal one. But we really see that women play such a crucial role as agents of change in mobilizing communities or implementing strategies to fight climate change. So this is definitely something that we see as a key factor of successful development cooperation. And then the third and last point, I think it is also key when we talk about being more effective in our development cooperation, that we should also evaluate what we are doing. And in that respect, we have initiated an academic project with our Luxembourg Institute LISER in collaboration with JPAL, where we are going, as from March next year, reflect on our development cooperation policies and see what works and what doesn't, and try to learn the lessons of that. So thank you very much for allowing me to intervene by video conference, and thank you again for the interesting debate.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you. Next, could I please call on Mrs. Ingrid Brokova, who's the Deputy Foreign Minister of the Slovak Republic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and good afternoon to all of you. And first of all, let me start by thanking Switzerland for organizing this important event, and many discussions so far, very inspiring, very interesting. So we indeed live very challenging times and dynamic times. We face many multidimensional challenges and budget constraints, and the question is really how to mobilize potential of all of resources and to retain sustainability. So a question is also how to transform the way we work together. And so let me make 3 short remarks. First on coordination, second on data, and third on inclusion. So first on coordination, it is critical. Coordination of donor countries as well as of different stakeholders. Trust among ourselves is the key. And coordination on the ground has become more difficult during pandemic. Having people in the field with the knowledge of local context and needs has been critical to bring effective solutions. So, and there are some good examples, some good practice to learn from. Team Europe initiatives, also very highly appreciated Black Sea Grain Initiative, and also, of course, Ukraine. Since the attack of Russia against Ukraine, over 1 million refugees from Ukraine crossed our borders, and over 100,000 of them applied for temporary status protection. Our experience has confirmed the importance of effective partnerships, clear division of roles, and coordination on the ground. And we thank all partners, especially relevant UN agencies, for helping us to navigate through this challenge. My second point is on data. In order to be able to coordinate ourselves and better align our projects with needs of people, we must know what each part of development system is doing and how we are progressing in the SDGs. The GPEDC monitoring exercise is an important tool in this endeavor. We plan to participate in it and encourage others to do so as well. Data are key also for the accountability to towards our citizens and building trust, which is lacking today in the multilateral system. Recently, OECD Multilateral Development Finance Report 2022 highlights rising role of multilateral organizations and risk of increased fragmentation. Transparent investments, applying nexus and context-sensitive approach are key. And my last but not least point is on inclusion. We need to have inclusive process on the national level to include women and girls, marginalized people, remote regions, local actors, civil society, just to mention a few. So development cooperation is not a competition, although very often it seems to be a race against time. There is not just one winner, but we must not risk losing in a collective manner, and we increase our chances of success if we advance together. I thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you. Next, can I please invite Shara Razavi, who is currently the Director of Social Protection at the ILO, previously with UN Women, previously with UNRIST, I'm very proud to say. So Shara, please.
Thank you very much, Paul, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank our Swiss colleagues for having given me this opportunity of 2-minute intervention, if I may. First of all, thank you to the panelists for a very rich and engaging panel. And now I think the point I want to bring to this panel is to say that from all the multiple crises that we have been living through, if there is a sort of silver lining to it, it was the fact that we now do have the emergence of a consensus on the importance of all countries to have robust and universal social protection systems. And I'm talking about systems and not just ad hoc cash transfers that come in the context of emergencies, to really engage in system building. And in fact, you know, the history of the Nordic countries, many other countries, shows that social protection systems, it's not something that countries build after they develop. They build social protection systems in order to develop. I think that's a really important point to keep in mind, and UNRWA's research is there for everyone who wants to read about that history. And I think it's now very widely recognized that social protection systems can be a real response and both a social and economic to necessity. Rights-based social protection systems that are gender responsive, and I think this point has been emphasized very much today, can help people navigate the kind of risks that they face throughout their lives, from ill health to unemployment to old age, and they can reduce inequalities. They can be very effective in reducing inequalities. And also in periods of crisis, they can act as economic and social stabilizers. Now, 2 quick points. To change course, countries really need to overcome many of the constraints that they face, many structural constraints. They need to formalize their labor markets, whether it's in the rural areas, agriculture, or in other sectors. They need to create fiscal space. We heard a lot about that, through tax systems, through social security contributions, and they need to strengthen the governance of social protection systems so the public has trust in the system and knows that it works, that it's transparent, that it's democratically governed. Now, building these social protection systems requires efforts and has a cost. We talk a lot about the financing of closing the fiscal gap for social protection systems, but let's not forget there is also a cost to inaction. That means wasted lives, lost opportunities, social polarization, and political unrest. Now, my last point is that in September 2021, the UN Secretary General launched the Global Accelerator on Jobs and Social Protection for Just Transition as a system-wide initiative to support countries to make the much-needed investments in building universal social protection systems while also investing in millions of jobs in various sectors, in particular the care sector, and promote ecological transition. Development partners can put their weight behind this important initiative to allow more countries to create their own pathways for a human-centered recovery from today's multiple crises and to better be prepared for future crises. The Global Accelerator is being implemented with UN support in a number of countries that are ready for this transformation. Our question is, are development partners ready to come in? Thank you.
Thank you, Shara. Thank you. We are running out of time, but and before we turn to our last intervention, I would like to prep the panelists in a traditional way to have a one-sentence takeaway that you would like us, the audience, the conference, to take away the most important thing that you've heard that will actually strengthen the implementation of the principles over the next decade. But I think our last intervention from the floor will be from Eric Manzi, who's the Deputy General Secretary of the ITUC. Please, thank you. It will be in French, so please, if you need translation.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. It's my turn to thank the panelists for their enlightening statements. However, on behalf of the trade union movement, I would like to mention that a cooperation for development must face the worldwide obstacles that we're now facing now, and the response must be appropriate. Using the social contract, considering the decent work and sustainable growth that respects the climate and just transition to fair wages. And Madame has mentioned social protection and respect of workers, and all of this must be done. And here I agree with the panelists, Madame Munoz, that we must have an inclusive model of development where we leave no one behind. And then the the global partnership has an important role to play for this to come true through cooperation in development that is effective. And there are initiatives. And Madame Munoz mentioned this. There is a global driver for growth and for just transition, and this should be used in cooperation development. We have the Global Fund for Social Protection that should be set up that could play an important role in social protection. And to contribute in an effective way to cooperation in development, we must think about increasing public aid to development to finance the different programs and to develop greater resilience in our countries. To wind up, I would like to mention as well that it is very important for countries to engage in an inclusive model of development, not only showing good results and good statistics, but it must truly be based on the needs of the population and the well-being of the population. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Moderator, for giving me the floor.
Thank you. So I don't know who may be ready with their one-sentence takeaway. Maybe we can proceed in this same direction, please.
Thank you, Paul. Inclusive partnership is essential in response to unprecedented global challenges more effectively.
Inclusive partnerships. Thank you.
It's interesting. I was going to say the same thing.
Great. So we have two votes.
No, let me, we are in the middle of terrible crises, but it does give us that momentum and possibility to actually make that structural change that we've thought about and discussed for a long time that we actually need. So the opportunity for structural transformation to achieve that inclusive development that we're looking for. And that's kind of development speak. So in very practical terms, just to pick on one intervention that Norway will be supporting is climate adaptation linked to that structural transformation of rural areas, rural development, food production, local value chains to support food security and formalization of that sector. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll speak about transparency and mutual accountability. Why transparency and mutual accountability? Because we have different commitments. The donor part of the world has committed to a certain percentage of ODA on GNI, right? The recipients are also committing to comply in terms of transparency, disclosure, measurement, and assessment. So the only way to regain the trust is to be transparent and hold each other accountable on what we commit to do on both sides. If we do that, I believe even what my colleague from Malawi did mention about lack of flexibility to move resources, I think that will also be addressed as long as everything is transparent, you have disclosure, you have reporting, and then accountability kicks in, we should be able to drive our ambition despite all the shocks that we are going through. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elsa.
Thank you. I wanted to say on partnerships that UN Women, together with the Gates Foundation, governments here present, both as donors and as partners all over the world, together with civil society and the private sector, took an initiative to a partnership called Generation Equality, with the purpose to push very concretely the world ahead to reach SDG 5. So I'm proud of that, and I think it is good to try to think in new ways about new initiatives, but always based on evidence. So I wanted to share that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Gaki.
Well, I love the reminder to focus on human-centered recovery. And I think if we take that lens, some of the organizational, institutional, ideological hang-ups we have fade to back, and we focus on the right priorities. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Georgina.
Por favor.
Please. Transformation. Keeping at the heart, people at the heart for development. Opening civil spaces to organize civil society. Transparency and participation.
So we're very close to concluding. The organisers did ask me to try to tie it together, which seems like fairly difficult, I would say. And I think I have 5 quick points, if you just bear with me. I think there is a broad agreement, firstly, that development cooperation can play a critical role in supporting countries to respond to these crises, and that the effectiveness principles in particular do add value. They have something to offer, and different stakeholders can use them in different ways. But I think it would be also fair to say that we've heard examples of where they weren't followed, where there was fragmentation, where there were strictures around expenditures that meant that there wasn't enough flexibility at country level, viz. Spending on COVID or spending on cholera. So there's certainly room for improvement, and we actually need to learn about that. I think secondly, it was very clear that the country level is the main locus to lead coordination, to host the platforms for multi-stakeholder partnerships, which would include all ministries in government, bilateral or multilateral partners, the UN, civil society, foundations, and business. And it's not just because that's, what you should do. It's that each brings unique data, information, and perspectives on how you can improve things. And I think in addition to that, probably right at the base, is a conversation with local communities based very much on respectful and trust-building participation. Thirdly, I think we heard that we need to show some humility, that we need to be honest and learn from each other in a very, very fair way about what didn't work in all countries through these crises, and to be fair, what still isn't working, and the future crises that will inevitably come. Fourthly, that if you actually do adopt a people-centered, human-centered, human rights-based, gender-equal lens, then you will do things in a better way. And if you put people right at the forefront, then you'll work out how to do things well for them very quickly. And as Gargi said, then some of your entrenched positions on how you do this do fall away a bit. And it's important for people, because people want things to work. They want governments to work for them. They want the assistance provided by their partners to also work for them. And lastly, I am going to come back to policy coherence, because I think it would be unfair to think that whole of government approaches only exist on one side, and that whole of government approaches mean getting the governments of labour and education and health and planning on the so-called recipient side together to show leadership correctly. But what about whole of government approaches on the cooperation provider side that extend through trade, that extend through environment, that extend through home affairs and the treatment of migration, that extend to all other of the things that have come up in relation to debt, to vaccine equity, to the support for care systems, for the building of social protection systems. So I think that effective cooperation provision is one part of it, but if you only see it as the only part, then you're missing a huge part of how you can build a fairer, more sustainable, and more equitable world. So with that, please do feel free to add to that. I think there's an app where you can sort of agree or disagree with things and send questions, so please do that. But lastly, can we just thank our panelists one last time for a really interesting and insightful panel.